Hey guys, hope everybody's doing well. So before we were kind of talking and we were introducing um, this idea of the top 1% and the top 10% owning the majority of the wealth in the US, um, and this wealth gap that exists in the US and how it's been changing and growing. Um, and a lot of people are kind of struggling with um, what that actually looks like. So the purpose of this meeting is I just wanted to help you guys figure out what that looks like on the day to day, on a daily basis, right? So how does that affect my daily life, and how can I see these things happening, right? It's one thing just to look at like analytically, look at the numbers, and you're like, okay, what does that mean? But this this is going to kind of show you like where you will see that in real life. So hopefully this helps you guys thinking about it a little bit better. I'm going to present to you some information. Then we're going to fill out some Google forms, and then we will all meet up together, and then we will live on to fight another day. Um, so first of all of these graphs that I got are from Inequality for All. It was a documentary put together by Robert Reich. Um, so Robert Reich is a very well-known economist. He worked under um, President Carter, President Ford, and President Clinton. Um, and he's still very active in social media. If you want to follow him on Twitter or something like that, I don't know what you kids do these days, but he's very big at advocating for economic changes that he sees, and he's also not afraid to call things out. And um, some people think he's pretty radical, but he's really just trying to spread information, right? And he's a really smart guy, um, and he does a really good job at explaining why things are happening the way they are. Um, so that's why I kind of took his inspiration for this one. So if you want to check him out, follow him on social media. If you want to watch the film, it's actually on Netflix. It's called Inequality for All. And if you don't want to do that, you can just go to his website and find some more information. So like I said, this is to help you guys visualize. So I'm not as worried about the exact numbers. The point is just to get the main message across. So here's a typical median household income. They say it's 25 to 75,000. That's as of 2012. If you look there. So that's the other thing I forgot to mention is this is from like 2013, 2014 is when this was put together. So it's a little dated, but still very relevant and prevalent. So here we have, I would say this just looks like an average house, right? Like this is a typical middle class house. You guys have probably seen a million of these, right? Um, so what we want to look at next is what the typical 1% house looks like, right? So this is a typical 1%, you know, really nice. This would be like doctors, lawyers. They're making around 300,000 more than the, typical middle class, but also, right, we talked about they deserve sometimes, right? Like there should be gaps between different professions because that means that there's motivation to go to school longer, right? For doctors and lawyers, and they invest more, and so they should get more out of it, right? But the thing is, when that gap grows so large, so that's the doctors and lawyers is the bottom 1%, and then we have our entrepreneurs still, which can make millions of dollars. And on top of the entrepreneurs, we have CEOs and Wall Street and actors and athletes and things like that that can make tens of millions of dollars, right? And this isn't even including, Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg and things like that. So all of a sudden, that that middle class house is like a little tiny dot, and then even our doctor lawyer house is really nothing compared to how much wealth the rest of the 1% owns. So it's not even just the gap between the middle class and the top 10 or the top 1%. Within the 1%, there is still huge gaps, and so that's what a lot of people are talking about. But the question is, how did this happen? And there's not really like an answer like, oh, it was this policy, this happened. It's not like that. It's like thinking about how different things intertwine and how the world works to think about how could this have happened, right? Um, because there's not really an answer. So Robert Reich and a lot of other economists point at a chart that looks like this, and this is the growth of wages and productivity. And so our red is how much wages have increased, and the blue behind that, which you can't really see, is the growth in GDP, though. So that blue chart goes all the way up here, and then highlighted in yellow is the gap between these two, right? So if we look on the left on our y-axis, um, it has these percentages. So these percentages mark how much the wages or productivity increased. So as you can see, around 1971, 72, the productivity and the wages started to split off. What's the problem with this? Well, if productivity is increasing exponentially, it's just it keeps going up and up and up, and wages are just kind of barely increasing. It doesn't really make sense, right? Because that means that workers are producing a crazy amount more, and they're really not making as much as they should as they're making more and more, right? Um, so this is what a lot of people point to as the reason why we need a higher minimum wage, right? So what a lot of people will do is they'll say, okay, if the wages have had increased with productivity like it should have, like many people think it should have, this is what the minimum wage would be and should be, right? Um, so this is one chart that a lot of people who advocate for higher minimum wages look at, because there is such a big gap between productivity and wages, or the growth of those things. So if that's a little confusing, here's just looking at some typical wages. So as you can see, it says that these wages are adjusted for inflation. Um, so this is from 1978. So maybe in 1978, a Coke was 10 cents, and today a Coke is $1, right? So we're adjusting their salaries. We've talked about inflation before, but we're just adjusting their salaries to show, the value of the dollar, to adjust the value of the dollar. And the reason that we're looking at a typical male worker specifically is because women in the workplace, right? So women's wages have drastically increased, and just their role in the workplace has drastically increased and is still increasing to this day. So that's kind of an outlier because they were already treated so poorly in the workplace, during this time, that it would make the increases look better, or it would make the salaries look different. So we're just trying to make it normalized, I guess, to make it easier to see. So typical male worker makes around 48,000. Typical 1% makes around 390,000. And I just accidentally gave a sneak peek, but this doesn't look that bad. It looks a lot like when we had our middle class house next to the doctor house, right? There should be that gap, at least a small gap, right? But in 2010, we found the typical 1% is making over $1 million. So that's a $700,000 increase, and the typical male worker is actually making 15,000 less, right? So it's not even that the typical 1% is shooting up and the average male worker is just kind of going up. They're going in opposite directions, right? And at very different paces. So one is shooting up and one is just gradually going down, which is just widening that gap, right? Um, faster than it ever really has been. Um, so just to look at some jobs and compare, again, adjusted for inflation, from the 70s to the 2010s, these people are actually making less, right? So a bank teller is actually making less based on inflation than what they were in the 70s. And a meat packer is making significantly less, right? But obviously, there's other factors that go into this, right? So maybe the meat packer is making less because now we have technology that can package the meat and do those things, right? But the point is that these jobs are making less money than what they were in the 70s. So here we have our suspension bridge graph again, just to remind you guys. So this graph is showing how much wealth the top 1% owns. So in 1928 and 2007, the top 1% owned around 24% of the US wealth, right? Um, and we talked about what happens in 1929 and what happens in 2008, right? So in 1929, we have the Great Depression. In 2008, we have the Great Recession. Um, so Robert Reich points out that once it reaches this 23%, we tend to see just economic instability and things fall apart, right? And beyond just things falling apart when it gets that high, um, one of the best economic times we ever had, known as the Great Prosperity between 1947 and 1977, we saw some of the lowest um, percentages that we had ever seen, right? 10% and below. And this is post World War II. People are buying cars, houses, and the wealth is very evenly distributed. Like this is one of the strongest middle classes that the U.S. has ever had. Um, and why is that? Well, some people think that it's because we were taxing the wealthy more, right? Um, so today you can see it's around 35% is what we tax the wealthy. Um, but as you can see, around 1940, 35, after the Great Depression, they realized we need money and we can't get it from the middle class. We need to get it from the top 1%. They need to pay more into this so that way we can take care of our infrastructure, we can take care of our programs, etc. Um, so if you look at it, from 35 to around 1980, so that's almost 50 years. The wealthy are being taxed 70% or above, right? And most of the time it's above 80%. Um, and like I said, that's also known as the Great Prosperity, right? And then in 1980, Ronald Reagan comes to office and he proposes trickle down economics. So he says if the wealthy have all the money, all the money will eventually trickle down into the middle class, lower class. And spoiler alert, it didn't work. Yet we continue to tax uh, to keep those low taxes on the top 1% just because it became the normal, right? So a lot of people who say we should raise taxes today are, very, very radical people. They're called very radical people, when in fact, it's only been in our lifetime that the wealthy were not taxed um, above 40%, right? But for a large majority of just the past 100 years, we have seen um, or at least over half of the past 100 years, uh, the wealthy were taxed well above 70%, and that was when the economy prospered. So like I always say, I'm not here to push any agendas or anything. um, you know and these are not even necessarily the answers. This is what Robert Reich sees to be the problems uh, with the growing gap. And there's a lot of other factors, but I really just wanted to paint a picture for what you guys are seeing on a day to day. And the last one that I want to show is it's really just incredible to me. So um, real household debt and income. So this is looking at the dark red is the household debt. The white flat line is male wages, which we saw earlier how it was flatlining like that. And our y-axis on the left is the ratio that it's increasing, right? So the male wages is actually below 1, and the household debt hits 12. So the point of this is that, introducing credit has really hurt the middle class hard because the middle class wants to buy nice things and do these nice things, and they'll take out credit and go into debt to own those nice things. And they're the ones that are really hurt because the top 1% can afford these things. The middle class wants to be like that, but they really can't afford to be like that, and it hurts them, right? And they're not making nearly the money that they should based on um, the wages that we looked at earlier. So like I said, you can look at this documentary on Netflix. And here's the Google form that I want you to complete. And then after that, we will come together as a class once more. So just the breakdown of this lesson. Um, is I actually did this lesson for while I was student teaching, and I shortened it up a little bit. It was kind of a longer because we were feeling things out. Um, but I like this lesson because it just um, helps show students, what's going on. And I know that this is supposed to be, an I do, we do, and I feel like a lot of the checking in for me is um, very important. So there's a lot of times during this where I would, ask them questions, what do you think that the next house is going to look like? Is this the top 1% or is this, the lower 1%? Is this what you think of when you think of a millionaire house? Just questions like that. Um, and also just even just posing questions, asking them to explain what's going on. Um, so I think that's really important, at least in my virtual lessons and the experience that I've had online, as well as just letting them, predict what they think will happen after, something like this, where you're talking about, um, the late 70s salaries. Um, you know, what do you think is going to happen? What do you think is going on? And I think that's really important to get their brains going. And uh, I definitely would, not call out, but make sure I'm checking in on the students who are struggling. And most of these are pretty low risk questions, um, and a lot of it is just real world. So um, when I did it with when I was student teaching, I got a lot of interesting comments and uh, things like that talking about, oh, well, I've actually seen that, or oh, I haven't seen that. And then other students would say, oh no, we've seen that. It's just like when you're working at Subway, or you know kids always find a way to connect it really well, better than I think we try to. But yeah, this is like I said at the beginning of this too, this is also piggybacking off of a prior lesson. um, so I just think that this is a great way to illustrate what's going on. And I think it helps the students who are struggling, um, just to visualize that and think about it in a different way. But I think it's also still very supportive of students who do understand, because it gives them, I didn't focus as much on the numbers, um, but it gives students who really do comprehend and understand a better idea of what's going on. So I think that it's important to have the numbers and the visualizations, because, it's just how your brain works. If you're a numbers person, you're going to be looking at the percentages on the side. If you just want to see the gap, you go, oh, whoa, that's a pretty big gap. Um, so that was my philosophy behind this. And then I think with the Google form, um, so the Google form is pretty simple. Uh, what can the United States government do to help lower the inequality gap? It's something we haven't really talked about in this, but just want to get them thinking. Why is the growing inequality gap a bad thing? Um, again, just get their brain thinking. What factors besides the ones we talked about might contribute to the growing inequality gap? So this is an extension of what we were talking about, but I think just even based off of this PowerPoint that I would present, I think that they can answer those questions. And like I said, it's also pretty low stakes because there's not right answers, but it's still assessing whether they understand what is going on with the inequality gap, because these are questions on how to solve it, why is it a bad thing, and what is contributing to it. So it's just expanding on those thoughts. And if students are struggling to answer those Google form questions, I'll be able to see them. But even after that, we'll come back together and make sure that everybody leaves with an understanding. But I'll still be able to analyze how the individuals did, since our breakdown won't be till after the Google form. So I hope I did this video right with the I do, we do. Um, but yeah, thank you for watching this.